Sometimes a man believes his heart is frozen solid, that no warmth will ever reach it again. Buck Rawlins had lived alone on his mountain for 8 years, speaking only to his dog and the wind. One winter night, his dog started barking at the door like something was wrong. Buck opened it to find a woman collapsed in the snow, nearly frozen to death. He brought her inside and nursed her back to health. As she got stronger, he learned she was running from dangerous men with guns and bad intentions. Buck thought he was done caring about anyone, but this woman was changing that. What secrets was she hiding that would turn his quiet life upside down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat 11,000 feet above the valley floor, where the air bit sharp and clean, and winter held dominion for 8 months of the year. Buck Rawlins, he had built it himself, with timber he'd felled and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed, back when his hands were steadier and his reasons for isolation fresher. Now, at 58, he moved through his morning routine with the measured precision of a man who'd learned that survival demanded consistency. The coffee pot sat on the wood stove, black as tar and twice as strong. Buck poured himself a cup and stood at the single window that faced east, watching the sun creep over the peaks like honey poured slow over granite. Bristle, his red heeler, stretched and yawned from his place by the fire, then padded over to nose at Buck's leg. "Morning, old friend," Buck murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. At 12 years old, Bristle was showing his age grey around the muzzle, slower to rise, but still sharp-eyed and devoted. The dog had been his only companion since Sarah passed, and before that, since he'd come back from the war, with too many ghosts and not enough peace, the foes. Cabin was sparse but well kept. A single room with a sleeping area curtained off in the corner, a kitchen that consisted of the wood stove and a hand-built counter, and a sitting area with 2 chairs Buck had whittled from pine during the long winter of '87. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books he'd read and reread: Thoreau, Emerson, some Louis L'Amour westerns, and a few volumes of poetry Sarah had loved. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes and greying hair, and beside it a cavalry saber that hadn't seen daylight in years. Buck had been a scout for the army back when the frontier still had teeth. He'd ridden with men whose names were whispered in saloons and sung in ballads, tracking through territory where a wrong turn meant death and a right one meant living to see another sunrise. The pay had been good, the work honest in its own brutal way, but the cost had been higher than he'd understood at the time. Sarah had waited for him, tending the small farm they'd started in the valley below. She'd waited through the Apache campaigns, through the winter when he'd been trapped behind enemy lines for 3 months, through the fever that nearly took him in. 78. She'd waited until consumption took her instead, leaving Buck with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. He'd sold the farm the day after the funeral and climbed this mountain with nothing but Bristle, his tools, and a determination to live quietly with his memories. The townsfolk below, what few remained in Cedar Ridge, thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had for a while. But the mountain had taught him that solitude wasn't madness, it was clarity. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles down the winding trail that Buck had cut himself, and the town sat another 15 miles beyond that. In winter, when the snows came heavy, he might not see another human soul for months. He preferred it that way. People brought complications, expectations, reminders of a world that had moved on without him. His days followed a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Dawn brought coffee and planning. Morning meant tending to the animals, a milk cow named Bessie, 3 goats, and a handful of chickens that somehow survived the altitude and the cold. Afternoon was for maintenance, chopping wood, checking traps, or reading. Evening brought supper, often fresh trout from the creek or rabbit from his snares, and the companionship of firelight and silence. Buck had learned to read the weather like scripture, to predict storms days in advance by the way the wind shifted or how the animals behaved. He could tell the difference between the howl of wind through the peaks and the distant cry of a mountain lion. His hands, scarred from years of hard work and harder fighting, could build or repair anything he needed to survive. The mountain demanded respect, but it offered something precious in return: honesty. There was no pretense at this altitude, no room for anything but truth. A man faced his real self up here, stripped of the comfortable lies that made civilization bearable. Buck had found that self to be harder and sadder than he'd expected, but also more resilient. Bristle suddenly lifted his head, ears perked toward the door. Buck set down his coffee cup and listened. Wind through the pines, the distant trickle of the creek, but nothing else. The dog remained alert, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" The healer whined softly, then moved to the door and sniffed at the gap beneath it. His hackles weren't raised, but something had caught his attention. Buck pulled on his boots and heavy coat, then opened the door to step onto the covered porch. The morning air hit him like a slap, clean and bitter. Snow had fallen during the night, not heavy, but enough to dust the world in fresh white. Buck's breath steamed as he scanned the tree line, looking for whatever had disturbed Bristle. Movement caught his eye near the edge of the clearing, not threatening, just different. A ptarmigan, maybe, or one of the mountain goats that sometimes wandered down from the higher peaks. He was about to turn back inside when he noticed the tracks. They led from the tree line toward his cabin, but they weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, filled with fresh snow but still visible. Someone had been here during the night, had walked right up to his porch. Buck felt his old instincts sharpen like a blade being stropped. In all his years on the mountain, no one had ever approached his cabin unannounced. The trail was too difficult, the destination too remote. Most folks didn't even know he lived up here, and those who did respected his desire to be left alone. He knelt and studied the prints more carefully. Small feet, probably a woman's boots, with a worn sole on the right foot that left a distinctive mark. The gait was uneven, suggesting injury or exhaustion. The tracks came from the direction of the high pass, which made no sense. That route was treacherous even in good weather, and with winter settling in, it was near suicidal. Bristle had followed him outside and was now sniffing at the tracks with intense interest. The dog looked up at Buck with an expression that seemed almost urgent, as if trying to communicate something important. "Well, old boy, looks like we had a visitor." Buck followed the tracks around the cabin, noting how they wandered, suggesting disorientation. Near the back corner, he found where the person had sat or fallen, leaving a depression in the snow. There were dark spots nearby, blood, he realized with a start. The tracks resumed, circling back toward the tree line, but they were even more erratic now. Whoever had been here was hurt, lost, and probably desperate. Buck's practical side told him to stay out of it. Mountain folk learned early that other people's troubles had a way of becoming your troubles if you weren't careful. But another part of him, a part he'd thought buried with Sarah, stirred with concern. Someone was out there in the wilderness, injured and alone, and winter was coming down hard. He might be a hermit, but he wasn't heartless. Buck went back inside and gathered his supplies: rifle, rope, medical kit, and a flask of whiskey for warmth or antiseptic. He left food and water for his animals, banked the fire, and laced up his heaviest boots. Bristle watched these preparations with obvious excitement, tail wagging. The dog loved any excuse for adventure, even in his old age. "Come on, boy. Let's go see who's been calling on us." The tracks led into the timber, winding between massive pines and over fallen logs. Buck moved carefully, reading the story written in the snow. The person had stumbled frequently, caught themselves on trees, rested often. This wasn't someone fleeing in panic. This was someone at the end of their strength. After an hour of tracking, he found her. She sat propped against a boulder, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Her dark hair was matted with snow and ice, her lips blue with cold. She wore a heavy coat that had seen better days, sturdy boots that matched the tracks he'd been following, and Buck's eyes narrowed a gun belt with a well-maintained Colt revolver. As he approached, her eyes snapped open. They were grey-green, like the color of the sky before a storm, and they fixed on him with an alertness that surprised him, given her condition. "Easy," Buck said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." She tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. Buck knelt beside her and offered the flask. She took it with shaking hands and managed a small sip, then another. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but stronger. "I didn't think anyone lived up here. Not many do. I'm Buck Rawlins. What's your name?" She hesitated, and Buck saw her eyes dart to the trees around them, as if checking for pursuit. "Elena," she said finally. "Elena Vasquez. Well, Elena Vasquez, you're about as lost as a person can get. What brings you to my mountain?" "Trouble," she said simply, and something in her voice told Buck that was all the explanation he was going to get, at least for now. Buck studied Elena's face as she gripped the flask, searching for signs of deception or danger. Years of scouting had taught him to read people like weather patterns, and this woman carried storms in her eyes. But beneath the wariness, he saw exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been running too long. "Can you walk?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Her left leg was angled wrong, and dark stains on her coat suggested more than one injury. "I can try." Elena braced herself against the boulder and attempted to stand, but her face went white with pain, and she sank back down. "Maybe not." Buck made his decision. "Bristle, stay close." He scooped Elena into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. She tensed at first, hand moving instinctively toward her gun, then relaxed as she realized he meant no harm. The journey back to the cabin took twice as long with Elena's weight, but Buck's years of mountain living had kept him strong. Bristle ranged ahead, occasionally looking back to ensure they followed. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words in Spanish that Buck couldn't quite catch. Inside the cabin, Buck laid her on his own bed and set about examining her injuries. The leg wasn't broken but badly sprained. More concerning was the bullet graze along her ribs, recent, maybe 2 days old, and showing signs of infection. "This needs cleaning," Buck said, heating water on the stove. "You're lucky it's just a graze." Elena's eyes snapped fully open. "You've done this before. Army medic training. Plus, living alone up here, you learn to patch yourself up." Buck returned with hot water and clean cloth. "This is going to hurt," she gritted, her teeth as he cleaned the wound, but didn't cry out. Buck had known soldiers with less tolerance for pain. When he finished, he helped her sit up and handed her a clean shirt of his own. "Your coat's ruined," he said, turning his back to give her privacy. "I'll see what I can do about clothes that fit better." "Why are you helping me?" Elena asked as she changed. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be dangerous." Buck turned back around, noting how his shirt hung loose on her frame. "Maybe, but dangerous or not, you're hurt, and it's going to snow again soon. Mountain law says you help folks in trouble, especially when winter's coming." Elena pulled a leather pouch from her coat pocket before Buck took it outside to dispose of it. The pouch was worn smooth from handling, and she clutched it like a lifeline. Whatever was inside, it was important enough that she'd risked everything to keep it. "What's in the pouch?" Buck asked. Elena's grip tightened. "Something that doesn't belong to me anymore, but that other people think it does." She looked up at him with those storm-grey eyes. "Something that's going to get me killed if they find me." "Who's they?" "Men who don't believe in leaving witnesses." Elena shifted uncomfortably on the bed. "I worked for a man named Cortez in Santa Fe. Rich trader, owned half the silver mines in the territory. I kept his books, managed his accounts. I thought he was legitimate until I found records of payments to Apache raiders, bribes to army officers, money moving through Mexican cartels." Buck felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You took evidence, ledgers, correspondence, bank records. Enough to hang him and half his organization." Elena opened the pouch and showed Buck several folded papers covered in neat handwriting and official seals. I was taking them to the territorial marshal when Cortez's men caught up with me in Alamosa. How many men? 4 that I saw. Maybe more coming. Elena's voice carried the weight of certainty. They won't give up. Cortez has too much to lose, and he pays his men well enough to ensure loyalty. Buck walked to the window and scanned the tree line. The mountain felt different now, no longer a sanctuary, but potentially a trap. 4 armed men in pursuit of a woman carrying evidence of major crimes. The isolation that had protected him for years had just become a liability. How long since you lost them? 2 days? Maybe 3? I've been moving at night, hiding during the day, but I'm slowing down, and they know this country better than I do. Elena tried to stand again, wincing. I need to keep moving. If they find me here, they'll kill us both. In your condition, you wouldn't make it a mile down the mountain. Buck turned from the window. Those men tracking you, what kind of men are they? The kind that enjoy their work too much. Elena's voice carried bitter experience. Diego Morales leads them. Former Rurales officer, kicked out for brutality. He's smart, patient, and he doesn't quit. Buck felt old instincts stirring, memories of tracking and being tracked across hostile territory. What weapons do they carry? Rifles? Pistols? Diego has a new Winchester repeater. They travel light, move fast. Elena watched Buck's face carefully. You're thinking like a soldier. Was a soldier? Long time ago. Buck moved to his rifle rack and checked the loads in his Spencer repeater. If they're good trackers, they'll find this place eventually. Snow won't hide it forever. Then I need to go. Elena struggled to sit up straighter. I won't bring this fight to your door. Too late for that. Buck's voice carried a finality that surprised him. Soon as I brought you inside, I took sides. Elena studied his face, seeing something there that made her relax slightly. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, but I owe it to myself to finish what I start. Buck moved around the cabin, his movements taking on the efficiency of a man preparing for war. Besides, been a long time since I had a real fight. Outside, Bristle began barking, not his usual alert bark, but the sharp, aggressive sound he made when strangers approached. Buck moved to the window and saw them immediately. 4 riders emerging from the tree line, spread out in a loose formation that spoke of military training. They found us, Elena whispered, her hand moving to her gun. Buck studied the approaching men through the window. Even at a distance, he could see they moved with the confidence of predators who'd cornered their prey. The leader, Diego, presumably was a large man with a dark beard, sitting his horse with easy grace. The others flanked him, rifles ready but not yet raised. They're not rushing, Buck observed. They know you're hurt. Figure we're trapped up here. We are trapped. Buck smiled, for the first time since finding Elena, and she saw something in his expression that was both reassuring and slightly frightening. Miss Vasquez, you've never been trapped with a man who knows these mountains like I do. He moved to the mantel and took down the cavalry saber, strapping it to his waist with practiced ease. The weight felt familiar, comfortable, like greeting an old friend. What are you doing? Elena asked. Something I should have done years ago. Buck checked his rifle one more time, then moved toward the door. Getting back in the fight. The riders had stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of rifle range. Diego raised his hand, and Buck could hear his voice carry across the snow. We know you're in there, Elena. Come out, and we'll make it quick. Stay hidden, and we'll burn you out. Buck stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but ready. Bristle stood beside him, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. You boys are trespassing, Buck called out. I suggest you turn around and head back down the mountain. Diego laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the thin air. Old man, you don't want any part of this. Just give us the woman and we'll leave you be. Can't do that. Buck's voice was steady, conversational. She's under my protection now. The four riders exchanged glances, and Buck could see them reassessing the situation. They'd expected to corner a frightened woman, not face a man who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been in similar situations before. "Your funeral, viejo," Diego called back, using a Spanish word that Buck understood perfectly. But as the riders began to spread out for an assault, Buck felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the sharp, clear focus of impending combat, and beneath it, the unexpected warmth of having someone worth fighting for again. Buck backed into the cabin, keeping his rifle trained on the riders as they began their approach. His mind raced through tactical possibilities, mapping the terrain he knew by heart against. The threat closing in. "Can you shoot?" he asked Elena, without taking his eyes off the window. "Well enough." Elena had managed to sit up, her Colt in hand despite her injuries. "But there are 4 of them. I've faced worse odds." Buck moved to his weapons cache, a wooden box he kept hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside lay items he hadn't touched in years: extra ammunition, a pair of Army-issue Colt pistols, and a leather-wrapped bundle containing throwing knives from his scouting days. The first shot shattered the window glass, sending shards across the cabin floor. Buck had anticipated it, already moving toward the back wall, where he'd cut a firing port years ago, just in case. The hole was barely visible from outside, disguised as a knot in the log wall. "They're testing our response," Buck explained, settling into position. "Diego's smart. He'll probe our defenses before committing to a full assault." Another shot rang out, this one aimed at the front door. The heavy oak held, but Buck could hear the bullet embed deep in the wood. Through his firing port, he could see 2 riders had dismounted and were using trees for cover, while the other 2 remained mounted, ready to flank or retreat. "There," Buck whispered, lining up his shot. One of the dismounted men had exposed too much shoulder while aiming. Buck's Spencer spoke once, and the man spun away from his tree, clutching his arm and cursing in Spanish. "First blood to us," Buck said with grim satisfaction. "Now they know we have teeth." Elena watched him work with growing amazement. The gentle mountain hermit who'd bandaged her wounds had transformed into something harder, more dangerous. His movements were economical, precise, like a craftsman who'd perfected his trade through years of practice. "You weren't just any soldier," she observed. "Scout for the 5th Cavalry, tracked Apache war parties across half of Arizona territory." Buck reloaded smoothly, eyes never leaving his firing port. "Learned to think like them, fight like them." Diego's voice carried across the clearing. "Miguel, how bad?" "Through and through," came the pained reply. "Still got use of the arm." Buck noted the tactical discussion, filing away information about their leadership structure and casualty response. These weren't common bandits. They moved and communicated like military men. A new voice called out, younger and more reckless than Diego's. "Let me burn them out, Jefe. I can get close enough to throw a torch." "Patience, Carlos," Diego replied. "The old man knows what he's doing, but he can't watch all directions at once." Buck smiled grimly. Diego was right. The cabin's isolation, which had seemed like protection, was becoming a liability. With Elena injured, he couldn't leave to establish defensive positions outside. They were essentially under siege, but Diego had made one critical error. He'd assumed Buck was just another mountain dweller who'd gotten lucky with a rifle. He didn't understand that he was facing someone who'd spent years learning to turn disadvantages into advantages. Buck moved away from his firing port and began pulling items from around the cabin: his spare oil lamp, a bottle of kerosene, strips of cloth from an old shirt. Elena watched with growing curiosity. "What are you doing?" "Changing the rules." Buck worked quickly, creating improvised weapons. "They think they have us pinned down, but this cabin has more secrets than they know about." Years ago, when paranoia had run deeper and isolation felt more precarious, Buck had prepared for the possibility of having to defend his home. Hidden throughout the cabin were advantages only he knew about. The firing port, loose boards that could be quickly removed to create additional shooting positions, and most importantly, the escape tunnel he'd dug from the root cellar to a concealed exit 50 yards away in the tree line. "Can you move if you have to?" Buck asked, checking Elena's condition. "If I have to." She gritted her teeth and tried putting weight on her injured leg. "But not far. And not fast. Won't need to be far. Just need to get to the trees." Buck explained his plan quickly. The tunnel would get them out unseen, but only if the attackers remained focused on the cabin itself. He needed to create a distraction dramatic enough to hold their attention while Elena made her escape. "What about you?" Elena asked. "I'll follow once you're clear." She looked at him skeptically. "You're planning something dangerous." "Dangerous is relative." Buck finished preparing his improvised devices. To a man who's lived alone on this mountain for 8 years, dangerous is running out of coffee. Elena almost smiled at that, the first time her expression had softened since he'd found her. "You're not what I expected when I saw you on that porch." "What did you expect? A kind man who was going to get himself killed trying to help me?" She paused. "I was half right." Another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls. Buck could hear the attackers moving, repositioning for what would likely be their main assault. Diego was taking his time, but that patience wouldn't last forever. Buck lifted a loose floorboard near the fireplace, revealing the entrance to his tunnel. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and reinforced with timber from trees he'd felled years ago. "Follow this straight for about 40 feet. Then up," Buck instructed. "You'll come out behind a fallen log, about 50 yards into the trees. Stay low, stay quiet, and head for the high ground to the east. And then, if I don't make it out, those papers you're carrying, get them to Marshal Thompson in Denver. He's honest, and he has the connections to make sure Cortez faces justice." Elena gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Don't you dare plan on not making it out." Buck met her eyes, seeing something there that reminded him of Sarah, not in appearance, but in the fierce determination that some women carried like a flame in their hearts. "I'll do my best to disappoint you, ma'am." As Elena disappeared into the tunnel, Buck made his final preparations. He soaked strips of cloth in kerosene, tied them around arrows he'd fletched years ago for hunting, and positioned them near his bow. The old longbow was another relic from his past, crafted during a long winter when grief had needed an outlet. The shots outside had stopped, which meant Diego's men were preparing for their final assault. Buck could picture their formation, 2 men approaching from the front, while the others flanked from the sides. It was textbook cavalry tactics, adapted for mountain warfare. Buck lit his first fire arrow and drew back the bowstring. Through his firing port, he could see Carlos creeping toward the cabin with what looked like a bottle of kerosene and a torch. The young man's eagerness was about to become his downfall. The arrow flew, true, striking the ground just feet from Carlos and erupting in a small ball of flame. The man jumped back with a curse, and Buck's second arrow found the spare kerosene bottle at Carlos's feet. The explosion lit up the mountain morning like a miniature sun. The explosion sent Carlos stumbling backward, his clothes singed, his confidence shattered. Buck heard Diego's roared command to fall back and regroup, buying precious minutes for Elena's escape. Through the smoke and flame, Buck watched the attackers retreat to better cover. Carlos was shaken but not seriously injured. Buck had aimed to intimidate rather than kill. Despite everything these men represented, taking a life still carried weight for him, even after all these years. Buck moved quickly to the tunnel entrance, listening for sounds of Elena's progress. The passage was tight, and with her injuries, movement would be slow and painful. He estimated she'd need at least 5 more minutes to reach the exit. Diego's voice carried across the clearing, speaking in rapid Spanish to his men. Buck's understanding was limited, but he caught enough to know they were discussing the unexpected resistance and revising their strategy. The word fuego, fire, came up repeatedly. A new worry crept into Buck's mind. If they decided to simply burn him out from a distance, Elena might still be in the tunnel when smoke began filling the passage. He needed to keep their attention focused on direct assault rather than siege tactics. Buck selected another fire arrow and aimed for a pile of dry brush near where he'd seen Miguel take cover. The arrow struck and caught immediately, creating a wall of flame between the wounded gunman and his companions. Miguel scrambled away from his position, exposing himself long enough for Buck to put a rifle shot close enough to keep him moving. "Stay busy, boys," Buck muttered, already moving to his next position. The cabin had 3 more firing ports, each carefully disguised and positioned to cover different approaches. Buck had spent years perfecting these defenses during long winter evenings when memories of Sarah grew too heavy to bear. What had begun as a distraction from grief had become a fortress. A rifle cracked outside, the bullet splintering wood near Buck's head. Through the smoke and flames, he could see a muzzle flash from behind a large pine. Diego had positioned himself well, using the distraction of the fires to advance his own position. Buck waited, patient as winter, for the next shot. When it came, he was ready. His Spencer answered immediately, bark flying from the pine where Diego sheltered. No cry of pain, but Buck heard the distinctive sound of a man throwing himself sideways to avoid follow-up shots. The tunnel should be clear by now. Buck glanced toward the entrance, fighting the urge to follow immediately. Elena needed time to find cover in the tree line before he abandoned the cabin's defenses. If he emerged too soon, the attackers might spot her movement and realize they'd been outflanked. A crash from the front of the cabin announced a new assault. Someone was attacking the door with an axe, probably Carlos, trying to redeem himself after the fire arrow incident. Buck could hear wood splintering under repeated blows. Buck abandoned stealth and moved to the front window, exposing himself to rifle fire from outside. Through the broken glass, he could see Carlos working frantically with the axe, his back to the window. The young man's position was protected from the other firing ports, but not from direct frontal assault. "Carlos!" Buck called out. The axe work stopped, and the young man spun toward the window, hand moving toward his pistol. "Your boss didn't tell you about windows." Buck's rifle spoke once, and Carlos dove away from the door, clutching his leg. Not a killing shot, but enough to remove him from the immediate fight. Buck was already moving when return fire from Diego and the remaining gunman shattered what remained of the window. Time was running short, the cabin was becoming untenable, and Elena had been given all the head start he could provide. Buck gathered his essential gear, rifle, ammunition, his father's pocket watch, and the small tintype of Sarah from his bedside table. Everything else could burn. He paused at the tunnel entrance, listening to the chaos outside. Carlos was cursing steadily in Spanish, Miguel was calling for covering fire, and Diego was shouting orders with the frustrated tone of a commander whose simple plan had become complicated. Buck smiled grimly and dropped into the tunnel. The passage was cramped and dark, barely wide enough for his shoulders. Elena had left traces of her passage, a few drops of blood on the earthen floor, disturbed dirt where she'd struggled with her injured leg. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and old timber, familiar scents from his construction work years ago. Behind him, he heard the cabin door finally give way. Boots thundered across his wooden floor, and voices called out discoveries: the hidden weapons cache, the firing ports, the tunnel entrance. Diego would realize quickly that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone with military experience. Buck emerged from the tunnel behind the fallen log Elena had used for cover. Fresh tracks in the snow led away toward higher ground, exactly as he'd instructed. She was moving slowly but steadily, and more importantly, she was moving smart, using available cover, avoiding open ground, choosing routes that would be difficult to track. From his concealed position, Buck could see the cabin clearly. Smoke was beginning to rise from inside, whether from knocked-over lamps or deliberate arson, he couldn't tell. Diego and 2 of his men were examining the tunnel entrance, while Carlos sat against a tree, binding his wounded leg. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. Instead of being besieged defenders, Buck and Elena were now the Hunters. His knowledge of the mountain terrain gave them significant advantages, and Diego's men were operating in unfamiliar territory. But Elena's injuries limited their options. They couldn't simply disappear into the wilderness. She needed medical attention and rest. More critically, winter was coming down hard. The morning's light snow was already thickening, and Buck could read the signs of a major storm building in the cloud formations above the peaks. Buck began moving upslope, following Elena's trail while staying far enough back to avoid being spotted from the cabin. The snow was actually helping, muffling his movements while making Diego's men easier to track. Their voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and their unfamiliarity with the terrain made them noisy. He found Elena resting behind a cluster of boulders about 200 yards from the tunnel exit. She was conscious and alert, but her face was pale with exhaustion and pain. Snow had begun collecting in her dark hair. "How long do we have?" she whispered as Buck settled beside her. "Not long. They'll figure out our route soon enough." Buck studied the terrain above them, planning their next move. "There's an old mine shaft about half a mile up this ridge, abandoned since the 72nds, but the main tunnel is still sound. We can hole up there until the storm passes." Elena looked at the steepening slope ahead, then at her injured leg. "I'm slowing you down. We're not running a race." Buck helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. "Besides, slow and steady wins in mountain country. Ask any pack mule." Despite their situation, Elena almost smiled. "Is that supposed to be encouraging? Pack mules are smart, stubborn, and they survive longer than horses up here." Buck began helping her up the slope. "I've been called worse things." Behind them, shouts erupted from the direction of the cabin. Diego had found their trail. The abandoned mine sat carved into the tattoos, mountainside like a wound that had never properly healed. Buck had discovered it during his third winter on the mountain, when a hunting expedition had taken him farther from home than usual. The original miners had given up when the silver vein played out, leaving behind timber supports, rusted equipment, and tunnels that burrowed deep into solid rock. Buck helped Elena into the main tunnel, grateful for the shelter from the increasing snowfall. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown brush, nature's way of reclaiming what men had abandoned. Inside, the air was cool but dry, and the sound of their breathing echoed softly off stone walls. "How deep does it go?" Elena asked, settling against a timber support with visible relief. "About 200 feet before it splits into smaller shafts. The main tunnel is sound, but I wouldn't trust the side passages." Buck used his knife to scrape together tinder and dry wood from debris left by previous bees, visitors, probably hunters, using the mine for emergency shelter. "We'll stay near the entrance where we can watch for trouble." Elena watched him build a small fire with practiced efficiency. The flickering light revealed more details of their refuge: iron rails for ore carts, rotted timber where roof supports had failed, and carved initials from long-dead miners who'd spent months in these depths. "Tell me about the war," she said as Buck coaxed flames from the tinder. Buck's hands paused for a moment before continuing their work. "Not much to tell. Young man's foolishness dressed up as patriotism. You were a scout. That's not the same as being just another soldier." "No, it wasn't." Buck fed larger pieces of wood to the growing fire. "Scouts worked alone, mostly, sometimes in pairs. We'd ride out ahead of the main force, looking for trouble before it found us. Apache were the finest guerrilla fighters in the world. They could disappear into country you'd swear couldn't hide. A rabbit." Elena pulled her knees up to her chest, both for warmth and to ease the pain in her injured leg. "Is that where you learned to think like you do? Always planning escape routes, backup plans?" "Partly. But losing Sarah taught me more about survival than any war ever could." Buck's voice carried a weight that made Elena look at him more carefully. "When someone you love dies, you learn that safety is mostly illusion. The only real security comes from being able to adapt when everything falls apart." The fire caught properly, casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. Buck arranged stones around it to contain the flames and reflect heat back toward them. The simple domestic action felt strange after the morning's violence. "How long were you married?" Elena asked softly. 15 years. Met her when I was 22, fresh out of the army and full of ideas about making my fortune in silver mining. Buck smiled at the memory. She was teaching school in a little town called Bitter Creek. Smartest woman I'd ever met, and brave enough to marry a man who didn't know the difference between love and infatuation. "And she taught you the difference?" "Every day." Buck pulled out his pocket watch, a brass timepiece worn smooth by years of handling. This was her father's. "She gave it to me on our wedding day. Said it would help me remember to come home on time." Elena studied his face in the firelight, seeing layers of grief and memory she hadn't noticed before. "You must have loved her very much." "Still do. Death doesn't change that, just makes it harder to carry." Outside, the wind was picking up, driving snow against the mine entrance with increasing force. Buck listened to the sound, reading the storm's intensity with the same skill he'd used to track Elena's pursuers. "How long will this last?" Elena asked, following his gaze toward the entrance. "Through the night, probably into tomorrow. Mountain storms move fast but hit hard." Buck checked his rifle, ensuring no snow had gotten into the mechanism, "which is good for us. Diego's men aren't equipped for extended cold weather operations. They might go back down the mountain." "Maybe, but Diego doesn't strike me as the type to give up easily. More likely they'll find shelter and wait for the storm to pass." Buck met her eyes across the fire. "Which gives us time to plan our next move." Elena pulled the leather pouch from her shirt, holding it like a talisman. "These papers, they're not just evidence of what Cortez has done. They're records of planned operations, including something big scheduled for next month." "What kind of operation?" "Arms smuggling. A shipment of stolen military weapons heading south to revolutionary forces in Mexico. The transaction is worth more than most people see in a lifetime." Elena opened the pouch and showed Buck several pages covered with detailed notes and figures. "If this goes through, Cortez will have enough money and political connections to become untouchable." Buck studied the papers by firelight, his military experience helping him understand the implications. "These weapon specifications, that's current army inventory. Someone with high-level access is involved. Colonel Marcus Webb at Fort Carson. He's been selling surplus weapons for years, using Cortez as his middleman." Elena pointed to a series of coded transactions. "The beauty of the scheme is that the weapons are reported as damaged or lost during training exercises. On paper, they've been properly disposed of. And in reality, they're sitting in a warehouse in Santa Fe, waiting for transport south." Elena's voice carried bitter satisfaction. "Along with detailed records of every transaction, every payoff, every name involved in the conspiracy." Buck understood now why Diego had been so persistent. These papers represented more than evidence of past crimes. They could prevent future ones and implicate people powerful enough to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed them. The territorial marshal, can he be trusted with something this big? Marshal Thompson has a reputation for honesty, but he's also a practical man. He'll want corroboration, independent evidence. Elena rewrapped the papers carefully. "The problem is that most of the evidence is in that Santa Fe warehouse, and Cortez will have moved it by now. Maybe not all of it." Buck fed another piece of wood to the fire, his mind working through possibilities. Men like Cortez get overconfident. They start believing their own success makes them invulnerable. "You're thinking of something specific?" "I'm thinking that Christmas is 3 weeks away. Traditional time for military units to transfer surplus equipment before the New Year's inventory. If Webb is planning one last big score before you expose him, he'll want to move fast." Elena studied Buck's face, seeing the tactical mind that had served him well as an army scout. "You're suggesting we try to stop the shipment. I'm suggesting we gather enough evidence to make your papers impossible to ignore." Buck met her gaze steadily. But that would mean going back down the mountain, into Cortez's territory, with a half-dead woman slowing you down, with a partner who knows Cortez's operation better than anyone. Buck's voice carried conviction that surprised even him. Elena, I've spent 8 years hiding from life up here. Maybe it's time I rejoined it. The wind howled outside their shelter, but inside the old mine, warmed by fire and possibility, both of them began to believe that survival might not be their only option. The storm raged through the night with the fury that only mountain weather could summon. Buck woke several times to tend the fire, listening to the wind's voice change as it carved new patterns through the peaks. Each time he rose, he found Elena watching him with those grey-green eyes, alert despite her exhaustion. "Can't sleep?" he asked during one of these midnight moments. "Too much thinking." Elena shifted position carefully, favoring her injured leg. "I keep wondering if we're making the right choice. Having second thoughts about going after Cortez. Having second thoughts about getting you killed for my cause." Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many good people pay for her decisions. "I worked for him for 2 years, Buck. I know how he thinks, how he operates. He doesn't just eliminate threats, he destroys them completely." Buck fed another piece of wood to the fire, watching sparks dance upward into the tunnel's darkness. "You think I don't understand what I'm getting into? I think you're a good man who's been alone too long, and maybe you're confusing helping me with finding a reason to live again." Elena's words were gentle but direct. "There's a difference between the two." Buck was quiet for a long moment, considering her observation. Outside, the wind moaned through the mine entrance like a voice calling from far away. "You're probably right," he admitted finally. "Been so long since I had something worth fighting for, I might not know the difference anymore. That's what scares me. Should scare you more if I was doing this just to help. Means my heart wouldn't be in it." Buck met her gaze across the fire. "But when I think about men like Cortez, profiting from other people's misery, when I think about that arms shipment heading south to cause more suffering, that's not about you anymore, Elena. That's about who I used to be before I hid up here." Elena studied his face, seeing something there that reminded her why she'd trusted him instinctively despite her usual caution. "Who were you before?" "Man who believed right and wrong mattered more than safe and easy." Buck pulled out the tintype of Sarah, holding it so the firelight caught her face. "Sarah used to say I had an oversized sense of justice, said it would get me in trouble someday. Was she right?" "She was right about most things." Buck tucked the photograph away. "But she also said that trouble was better than regret, and spending the rest of my life wondering what if would be worse than any danger I might face." Elena was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the implications of his words. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not the desperate gratitude of someone being rescued, but the careful consideration of a partner evaluating a shared mission. "If we do this, it has to be smart. Cortez has resources, connections, men willing to kill without question." Elena pulled the papers from her pouch again, studying them by firelight. "But he also has weaknesses. He's vain, territorial, and he trusts the wrong people." "Tell me about his operation." 3 main components: the legitimate trading business that serves as cover, the smuggling network that moves contraband, and the enforcement arm that eliminates problems. Elena traced connections between names on her documents. Diego leads the enforcers, but he reports to Cortez's lieutenant, a man named Vasquez. No relation, despite the name. Ramon Vasquez used to be a cavalry officer before he went bad. Buck felt something cold settle in his stomach. Ramon Vasquez? Tall man, scar along his jaw, always wore his hair long. Elena looked up sharply. "You know him?" "Served under him briefly during the Apache campaigns. He was a good officer, then smart, brave, cared about his men. Buck's voice carried disappointment more than anger. What happened to him? Same thing that happens to a lot of men when they discover how much money they can make by abandoning their principles. Elena's tone was matter of fact, but Buck heard the underlying sadness. He's been Cortez's right hand for 3 years now, handles the military connections, coordinates with Webb at Fort Carson. That could be useful. Old soldiers sometimes remember their loyalty to former comrades. Or it could get you killed faster. Elena leaned forward, her expression serious. Buck, these aren't men who'll be swayed by appeals to honor or shared history. They've chosen their path, and they've profited from it too long to turn back now. Buck nodded, accepting her assessment. Then we don't try to convert them. We outsmart them. How? By using their strengths against them. Military men think in patterns, follow protocols. If we can predict their responses, we can stay ahead of them. Buck began sketching in the dirt with a stick, drawing rough maps from memory. Cortez's warehouse in Santa Fe, what kind of security? Guards, but not many. The real security comes from location and anonymity. It's in the warehouse district. Looks like any other storage facility. Unless you know what to look for, you'd never identify it as anything special. What would we be looking for? Elena described the warehouse in detail, a converted freight. Building on the east side of town, usually guarded by 2 men during the day and 4 at night. The building had been modified with interior walls to create secure storage areas, and Cortez had invested in a new safe for the most sensitive documents. The safe is the key, Elena explained. It contains not just records of past transactions, but contracts for future shipments. If we could get those contracts, we'd have dates, locations, names, everything needed to prevent the next arms shipment. And to prove Webb's involvement beyond any doubt. Exactly. But the safe is in Cortez's private office on the 2nd floor, and getting to it would mean penetrating the heart of his operation. Buck studied his dirt sketches, thinking through approaches and contingencies. The tactical problem was complex, but not impossible. His years of scouting had taught him that the best plans were often the simplest ones. What if we don't try to penetrate anything? Buck looked up from his lave. Sketches. What if we make them come to us instead? Elena frowned. I'm not following. Cortez thinks you're dead or dying up here. What if you're not? What if you suddenly resurface with an offer he can't refuse? You want me to go back to him? Voluntarily. I want you to make him think you're coming back voluntarily. Buck's eyes gleamed with the kind of tactical thinking that had made him valuable as a scout. Men like Cortez always believe they're smarter than everyone else. That confidence is their weakness. Elena considered the implications, her expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue. You're talking about a con game. I'm talking about giving him exactly what he thinks he wants, while making sure he never gets what he actually needs. Outside their shelter, the storm was beginning to weaken, but inside the old mine, plans were taking shape that would prove more dangerous than any weather. Dawn brought silence to the mountain, the kind of profound quiet that follows a storm when the world seems to hold its breath. Buck emerged from the mine to find 3 feet of fresh snow blanketing everything in pristine white. The temperature had dropped significantly, and his breath steamed in the thin air as he surveyed their situation. No tracks disturbed the snow near the mine entrance. Either Diego's men had taken shelter elsewhere, or the storm had covered any signs of their presence. Buck moved carefully to higher ground, using his knowledge of the terrain to find vantage points while leaving minimal tracks of his own. What he saw from the ridge made his blood run cold. Smoke rose from the direction of his cabin, not the thin wisp of a banked fire, but the thick, black column of a structure burning completely. Diego had torched everything Buck owned, destroying 8 years of careful preparation and accumulated memories in a gesture of pure spite. But that wasn't what worried him most. Through his scope, Buck could see movement in the Tenor valley below. Not 4 riders, but 8. Diego had been reinforced during the night, probably by men who'd ridden up from the valley despite the storm. Cortez wasn't taking any chances with Elena's recapture. Buck studied the new arrivals carefully, noting their equipment and organization. These weren't more enforcers, they moved with the precision of trained soldiers, real cavalry, not former soldiers turned outlaw. That meant Cortez had called in favors from active military personnel, which suggested the conspiracy reached higher than even Elena suspected. Buck worked his way back to the mine, his mind racing through implications. 8 mounted men in winter gear, properly equipped for mountain operations, led by someone who knew enough about military tactics to coordinate with Diego's local knowledge. This wasn't a pursuit anymore, it was a full-scale military operation. Elena looked up as he entered the mine, reading his expression immediately. How bad? Worse than bad. They've got reinforcements, military reinforcements. Buck settled beside the fire, accepting the coffee Elena had managed to brew in a battered pot left behind by previous mine visitors. 8 men total, and they're not planning to leave until they find you. Elena's face went pale. Military? Are you certain? Moved like cavalry, equipped like cavalry. Either active duty or very recently discharged. Buck described what he'd observed, watching Elena's expression grow increasingly troubled. Someone with significant influence ordered them up here. Colonel Webb, Elena's voice was barely a whisper. If he's committed active troops to this operation, it means the arms shipment is more important than I thought. Or you know more than you realize. Elena pulled out her papers again, studying them with new urgency. I focused on the financial records, the obvious corruption, but if Webb is willing to risk court-martial by using active soldiers for personal business, she stopped, her eyes widening as she focused on a particular document. Buck, look at this. She handed him a page covered with technical specifications and delivery schedules. Buck's military experience helped him decipher the coded language, but what he read made him whistle low. These aren't surplus weapons, he said slowly. These are current issue, state-of-the-art munitions, including the new Gatling guns the Army just acquired. Elena's finger traced a line of inventory numbers. And something else, experimental ammunition designed for those guns. Buck studied the specifications more carefully. The ammunition described was unlike anything he'd encountered during his service, armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate fortified positions, incendiary shells that could devastate infantry formations, explosive projectiles that would make conventional artillery obsolete. This isn't arms smuggling, Buck realized. This is theft of military secrets. Secrets worth enough to justify a small war, to protect them. Elena looked toward the mine entrance where morning light was beginning to filter through. We're not just dealing with corrupt officials anymore, Buck. We're dealing with treason. The implications hit Buck like a physical blow. Elena wasn't carrying evidence of local corruption. She was carrying proof of a conspiracy that could affect national security. The weapons and ammunition described in her documents could change the balance of power along the entire southern border. Who else knows about these papers? Buck asked. No one. I discovered the files by accident while preparing Cortez's books for annual audit. I thought I was looking at routine smuggling records until I started recognizing some of the technical terms from my father's military service. Buck looked up sharply. Your father was military? Elena nodded, something painful crossing her expression. Artillery officer, killed during the Apache Wars. He used to talk about new weapon designs, innovations that would make traditional warfare obsolete. She touched the papers reverently. He would have understood what these specifications really mean, which is why you recognize their significance when others might have missed it. And why I'm probably the only person outside the dough. Conspiracy, who knows what we're really looking at? Elena met Buck's eyes steadily. If these weapons reach the Mexican revolutionaries, they'll have firepower superior to anything the army can field along the border. Buck felt pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place. That's why Webb is involved. This isn't just about money, it's about creating a military imbalance that someone profits from. French arms dealers? Maybe. Or German munitions manufacturers looking to field test their innovations in actual combat. Elena's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd spent 2 years studying Cortez's international connections. The point is, we're not just fighting to expose corruption, we're fighting to prevent a war. The weight of responsibility settled over them like a shroud. What had begun as Elena's personal quest for justice had become something much larger, much more dangerous. They were no longer fugitives trying to survive. They were the only people standing between a treasonous conspiracy and potential disaster. 8 armed men, military trained, with orders to eliminate us at any cost, Buck summarized grimly. And our only advantage is that they think they're hunting a wounded woman and an old hermit. Are those good odds? Buck smiled, the expression carrying none of the warmth she'd grown accustomed to seeing. This was the smile of a man who'd faced impossible odds before and learned to find opportunity in apparent defeat. Elena, in my experience, the best odds come when your enemies underestimate what you're really capable of. He moved to the mine entrance and studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone planning an ambush. The fresh snow would work in their favor, making the soldiers' approach visible from a distance while providing concealment for defenders who knew how to use it. They'll come up the main trail, Buck said, more to himself than to Elena. Military thinking take the most direct route, use superior firepower to overcome resistance, and we'll be ready for them? Buck turned back to face her, and Elena saw something in his expression that made her understand why Apache war parties had learned to fear men like him. No, Buck said quietly. We'll be gone, but they'll wish we were still here by the time they realize what we've really done to them. Outside, the mountain waited in pristine silence, about to become a battlefield where the stakes were higher than either Buck or Elena had imagined when they first took shelter together from the storm. Buck spent the next hour moving like a ghost through the snow-covered terrain, setting his trap with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. Years of mountain living had taught him to work with the land rather than against it, and now he applied those lessons to warfare. Elena watched from the mine entrance as Buck positioned carefully selected rocks, arranged fallen branches, and created what appeared to be random disturbances in the snow. To untrained eyes, his work would look like natural winter damage. To Buck, each element was part of an intricate plan designed to channel their enemies exactly where he wanted them. The avalanche chutes, Buck explained when he returned to the mine, breathing hard from exertion in the thin air. This whole ridge is unstable after heavy snowfall. All it needs is the right kind of encouragement. Elena studied the slope above them with new understanding. What she'd seen as merely difficult terrain, Buck recognized as a weapon waiting to be triggered. You're going to bring the mountain down on them. Part of it, enough to convince them we died in the slide while giving us cover to escape down the backside. Buck pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time against the position of the sun. They'll be here within 2 hours, moving slow because of the snow and their unfamiliarity with the terrain. What about Diego? He knows these mountains. Diego knows the main trails, the obvious routes. He doesn't know the hidden paths, the old mining tracks, the places only someone who's lived here for years would discover. Buck shouldered his pack, now loaded with essential supplies, salvaged from the mine's abandoned equipment. That's our advantage. Elena tested her injured leg, pleased to find the swelling had reduced during the night. She was still far from full mobility, but the combination of rest and Buck's field medicine had restored enough function to make travel possible. Where are we headed? Cedar Ridge first, to send word to Marshal Thompson about what we've discovered. Then Santa Fe, to finish what you started. Buck helped Elena secure her own pack, distributing weight to account for her injury. But first, we need to make sure Diego's friends get the message that this mountain belongs to people who know how to defend it. They left the mine through a concealed exit Buck had discovered during his initial exploration, a natural chimney that led to the surface 50 yards from the main entrance. The climb was difficult for Elena, but Buck's patient assistance and her own determination got them to the top without serious incident. From their new position, they could see the approaching soldiers spread out in tactical formation along the main trail. Buck studied them through his scope, noting their equipment and movement patterns. Professional military, no question, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain during conditions they hadn't trained for. "The leader's a captain," Buck observed, handing Elena the scope. "See the way the others defer to him? And that's standard army. Winter gear, not the improvised equipment mercenaries would carry." Elena watched the soldiers advance, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Active duty cavalry, hunting civilians on American soil. Webb's influence reaches higher than we thought. Or lower. Could be the captain doesn't know what he's really doing here. Buck began his final preparations, checking the positioning of ropes and charges he'd set earlier. Military men follow orders. Doesn't mean they understand the bigger picture. The soldiers reached the mine entrance sooner than Buck had anticipated. Their mountain training might be limited, but their physical conditioning was excellent. Diego led them directly to the main tunnel, his local knowledge proving valuable despite Buck's hopes otherwise. "Now," Buck whispered, triggering the first phase of his plan. The explosion wasn't large, just enough to collapse the tunnel entrance and send a rumble through the mountainside that could be felt rather than heard. Snow began to shift on the slopes above, small slides that would grow larger as they gained momentum. The soldiers reacted with military precision, taking cover and establishing a perimeter while their captain assessed the situation. But their response, though tactically sound, positioned them exactly where Buck wanted them. "Second charge," Buck murmured, activating a carefully placed explosive that brought down a section of cliff face above the soldiers' position. The avalanche that followed was modest by mountain standards, not the devastating wall of snow and ice that could bury entire towns, but a focused slide that crashed down the slope with unstoppable force. The soldiers scattered, some managing to reach safety, while others disappeared beneath tons of moving snow. Elena gripped Buck's arm as they watched the disaster unfold. "How many?" "Not many," Buck said quietly. "Enough to convince the survivors that we didn't make it out, but not enough to make me lose sleep." He helped Elena to her feet, already moving toward their escape route. "Military training teaches you to survive situations like this. Most of them will dig themselves out." They began their descent down the mountain's backside, using trails that existed more in Buck's memory than in any visible form. The route was treacherous, requiring careful navigation around hidden crevices and unstable rock formations, but it offered something invaluable: complete concealment from pursuit. "How long until they realize we're not buried under that avalanche?" Elena asked as they paused to rest beside a frozen stream. "Day or two, maybe longer. They'll have to dig through tons of snow to check the mine thoroughly, and by then our tracks will be covered by new snowfall." Buck consulted his mental map of the terrain ahead. "Question is, what do we do with the time we've bought?" Elena pulled out her papers, studying them with the intensity of someone planning a campaign. "The arms shipment is scheduled for December 20th, 8 days from now. If we can reach Marshal Thompson with this evidence, he might be able to coordinate with federal authorities to intercept the weapons. Might also be that Thompson's compromised, or that the conspiracy reaches high enough to neutralize federal intervention." Buck met her eyes across their small fire. "Sometimes the only way to stop bad people is to beat them at their own game. You're still thinking about infiltrating Cortez's operation. I'm thinking about finishing what you started when you took those papers. Your evidence proves the conspiracy exists, but it doesn't prevent the next shipment or identify everyone involved." Buck's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd found his purpose again. We need to get inside that warehouse, Elena, not just for the evidence, but to stop what's coming. Elena considered their situation carefully. They were fugitives from a military pursuit, carrying evidence of treason, facing opponents with resources and connections that could reach anywhere in the territory. By any rational measure, their chances of success were minimal, but rationality hadn't brought them this far. Buck's knowledge of mountain warfare and Elena's understanding of Cortez's operation had proved a formidable combination. More importantly, they discovered they worked well together, his tactical thinking complementing her intelligence gathering, her knowledge of the conspiracy enhancing his operational planning. "If we do this," Elena said finally, "we do it right. No improvisation, no hoping for luck. We plan every detail, prepare for every contingency." Buck smiled, recognizing the transition from desperate flight to purposeful mission. "You sound like a soldier. My father always said that successful operations depend on careful planning and flexible execution." Elena's voice carried pride and sadness in equal measure. "Guess it's time I found out if he was right." As evening approached, they began detailed planning for what would either be their greatest success or their final mistake. Behind them, the mountain held its secrets. Ahead lay the dangerous world of men who traded in death and called it business. But between the mountain's wisdom and their shared determination, Buck and Elena began to believe they might just be capable of stopping something terrible from happening. 3 days later, Buck and Elena crouched in the shadows behind Cortez's warehouse, watching the guard rotation with the patience of predators studying prey. The journey down from the mountain had been arduous, but successful. No signs of pursuit, no indication that anyone suspected they'd survived the avalanche. Santa Fe bustled with pre-Christmas activity, providing perfect cover for 2 people who needed to blend into crowds. Buck had traded his mountain clothes for the worn garments of a traveling craftsman, while Elena had transformed herself back into the respectable bookkeeper she'd once been. To casual observers, they appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a couple seeking seasonal work in the territorial capital. "Guard change in 15 minutes, Elena whispered, consulting the pocket watch Buck had given her. For 2 days they'd observed the warehouse operations, learning routines and identifying vulnerabilities. Miguel takes over the south entrance, and there's always a 3-minute gap when the positions overlap." Buck nodded, his attention focused on the building's second-floor windows, where Cortez maintained his private office. Light glowed behind curtained glass, suggesting the man himself was working late, exactly what their plan required. "Remember," Buck said quietly, "once you're inside, you have 20 minutes maximum before someone notices the guard change took longer than usual." Lockpicks borrowed from a sympathetic merchant, a small lantern with shuttered glass, and most importantly, a derringer Buck had acquired through connections he preferred not to discuss. She was nervous but determined, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "What if Cortez is in his office? Then you withdraw immediately. We get one chance at this, Elena. If something goes wrong, we won't get another." Buck's eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. "The safe is behind the painting of the Spanish conquistador. 3rd number of the combination is always the year of establishment for men like Cortez, 1,878 inches his case. And the first 2 numbers? His daughter's birthday, Maria, born February 14th, 1863. Elena had provided that detail from her intimate knowledge of Cortez's personal life. "If that doesn't work, we abort and find another way." The guard change proceeded exactly as they'd observed. Miguel emerged from the building's interior, exchanged brief words with his replacement, then walked around the perimeter before settling into his position. The 3-minute window opened. Elena moved with careful speed, using the skills Buck had taught her during their descent from the mountain. She reached the building's rear entrance unseen, worked Buck's improvised lockpicks with surprising proficiency, and slipped inside like a shadow gaining substance. Buck remained in position, watching for patrols or unexpected visitors while monitoring the time on his pocket watch. 18 minutes. 17. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Inside the warehouse, Elena navigated by memory and careful observation. The building's layout was familiar from her previous visits as Cortez's bookkeeper, but moving through it as an intruder felt entirely different. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially concealing danger. The stairs to the second floor creaked under her weight, despite her efforts at stealth. Elena paused at each step, listening for signs that she'd been detected. When she reached the upper hallway, she could hear voices from Cortez's office, the man himself in conversation with someone whose voice she didn't recognize. Elena crept closer to the door, straining to hear the conversation without exposing herself to discovery. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Shipment leaves tomorrow night, instead of the 20th, Cortez was saying. "Webb's nervous about security, wants to accelerate the schedule." "Smart move," replied the unknown voice. "My contacts south of the border are ready whenever you are. The revolutionary forces have already paid half the agreed amount." Elena realized with growing horror that their careful planning was about to become irrelevant. The arms shipment they'd hoped to prevent was moving 6 days ahead of schedule. Even if they succeeded in gathering additional evidence tonight, there wouldn't be time to alert authorities and coordinate an interception. She had to warn Buck, but that meant abandoning the mission and losing their only chance to access the safe. Elena forced herself to think clearly, weighing immediate action against long-term consequences. The conversation continued inside the office, providing details that confirmed her worst fears. The weapons were already loaded and ready for transport. The route had been changed to avoid expected law enforcement attention. Colonel Webb himself would oversee the transfer to ensure nothing went wrong. Elena made her decision. She retreated from the door and found a window overlooking the rear of the building. Buck was still in position, barely visible in the shadows. She signaled him using the simple hand codes he'd taught her, spelling out the urgent message, "Tomorrow night." Buck's response was immediate and clear. Proceed, Elena understood. They'd come too far and risked too much to abandon the mission now. Even if they couldn't stop tomorrow night's shipment, they might gather intelligence about future operations or identify additional conspirators. The safe might contain information about other arms dealers, other corrupt officials, other threats to national security. The office door opened, and Elena barely had time to conceal herself behind a stack of crates before 2 men emerged. Cortez, she recognized immediately, a well-dressed Mexican businessman with intelligent eyes and a carefully groomed beard. His companion was a stranger, but the man's bearing and clothing suggested military background. "Ensure your men understand the importance of discretion," Cortez told his visitor. "This operation has attracted more attention than anticipated." "The woman and her protector are dead," the military man replied confidently. "Captain Morrison confirmed the avalanche buried them completely." Elena felt a chill of recognition. Morrison, she'd heard that name in her father's war stories. A young lieutenant who'd served with distinction against the Apache. And he was involved in this conspiracy, it meant the corruption reached deep into the Army's command structure. The 2 men descended the stairs, their conversation fading as they moved toward the warehouse floor. Elena waited until she was certain they'd left the building before approaching Cortez's office door. The lock was more sophisticated than she'd expected, but Buck's improvised picks proved equal to the challenge. Elena slipped inside, shuttered her lantern to provide just enough light to work by, and located the painting Buck had described. The safe was exactly where he'd said it would be, a modern combination lock that represented significant investment in security. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she began working through the numbers Buck had provided. The 14th of February 2078. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside, Elena found exactly what they'd hoped for. Detailed records of arms transactions, correspondence with military officials, bank drafts from Mexican revolutionary contacts, and most importantly, schedules for future shipments, extending months into the future. But as she gathered the documents, Elena heard something that made her heart stop. Footsteps on the stairs, moving with the careful precision of someone trying to avoid detection. Someone else was in the building, and they were coming toward the office. Elena grabbed the most crucial documents and closed the safe, her mind racing through escape options. The footsteps were approaching steadily. Whoever was climbing those stairs knew exactly where they were going and wasn't concerned about making noise anymore. She moved toward the window she'd used to signal Buck, but froze when she saw movement in the alley below. More men positioning themselves around the building's perimeter. This wasn't a chance discovery, it was a trap. The office door opened behind her, and Elena turned to face Ramon Vasquez. Cortez's lieutenant stood in the doorway with a pistol drawn, his scarred face showing neither surprise nor satisfaction, just professional competence. "Miss Elena Vasquez," he said politely, as if greeting her in a social setting. "I wondered when you'd resurface." "Ramon." Elena kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "You're looking well for a man who's sold his honor. Honor is a luxury I couldn't afford after the war ended." Vasquez stepped into the office, keeping his gun trained on her while closing the door behind him. A cavalry officer's pension doesn't stretch far in civilian life. Outside, Elena could hear Buck moving. The subtle sounds were probably invisible to Vasquez, but she'd learned to recognize the mountain man's approach during their time together. He was coming, but he'd be walking into a prepared ambush. "How did you know we were alive?" Elena asked, hoping to buy time while Buck assessed the situation. Captain Morrison isn't as thorough as he believes. When his men investigated the avalanche site, they found evidence that 2 people had escaped before the slide. Vasquez moved closer, his gun never wavering. "Cortez decided to let you come to him rather than waste more resources hunting through the mountains. And Buck is currently surrounded by 6 armed men who have orders to take him alive if possible." Vasquez's expression remained professionally neutral. "Cortez is curious about the man who's been protecting you. Former cavalry scouts have valuable skills." Elena felt her heart sink. Buck's mountain warfare expertise had served them well in familiar territory, but this was an urban environment where his enemies held every advantage. 6 men with modern weapons, coordinated communication, and knowledge of his location. The odds were overwhelming. "What does Cortez want?" Elena asked. "The documents you've stolen, naturally, plus information about who else knows of their contents." Vasquez gestured toward the papers Elena still clutched. "Cooperation could lead to comfortable arrangements for both you and your protector. And if we refuse to cooperate, then tomorrow's arms shipment proceeds as scheduled, and 2 troublesome individuals disappear permanently." Vasquez's tone remained conversational, but Elena heard the finality beneath his words. "Cortez prefers to avoid unnecessary violence, but he's prepared for it when required." Elena weighed her options rapidly. The documents in her hands represented months of investigation and irreplaceable evidence, but they were worthless if she and Buck were dead. She needed to create an opportunity for escape while preserving what they'd worked so hard to obtain. "I'll need to discuss this with Buck," she said finally. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. My men have instructions to prevent any communication between you." Vasquez checked his pocket watch. "You have 5 minutes to decide, Miss Vasquez. Cooperation or consequences." Elena nodded, as if accepting his terms, then suddenly threw her lantern at the office window. Glass shattered and burning oil spread across the floor, creating immediate chaos and sending a clear signal to anyone watching from outside. Vasquez cursed and lunged toward her, but Elena was already moving. She'd learned more than lockpicking from Buck. During their mountain journey, she'd learned to think like a fighter. Instead of trying to reach the window, she rolled behind Cortez's desk and drew the derringer Buck had given her. "Drop the gun, Ramon." she called out, her weapon trained on him across the burning office. You don't have enough bullets for 6 men plus me, Vasquez replied, but Elena noticed he'd taken cover behind a filing cabinet. Don't need bullets for 6 men, Elena said. Buck will handle them. I just need 1 bullet for you. Outside, the sounds of gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Buck was fighting his way through the ambush, using every skill he'd learned during years of frontier warfare. Elena could hear the distinctive crack of his Spencer rifle, followed by shouts and confusion from Cortez's men. The office fire was spreading rapidly, fed by spilled kerosene and dry paperwork. Vasquez realized his tactical situation was deteriorating, trapped in a burning building with a determined woman who showed no signs of surrendering. This ends badly for everyone, Vasquez warned. Already ended badly the day you decided to betray your oath, Elena replied. Now it's just a question of who pays the price. The building shook as something heavy, probably. Buck crashed through the warehouse's main floor. More gunfire, closer now, suggested the fight was moving toward the stairs. Elena heard Buck's voice calling her name, muffled by distance and smoke, but unmistakably alive and angry. Vasquez made his decision. Instead of continuing the standoff, he bolted for the office door, choosing to face whatever was happening downstairs, rather than remain trapped with Elena and the spreading fire. Elena let him go, focusing instead on gathering the remaining documents from Cortez's safe before the flames could destroy them. The fire was consuming everything combustible in the office, but she managed to salvage the most critical papers evidence that could stop not just tomorrow's shipment, but future operations as well. Buck appeared in the doorway, smoke-stained and grim-faced, but apparently uninjured. Time to leave, he said simply. Elena stuffed the papers into her shirt and followed Buck toward the window. Behind them, Cortez's office burned like a funeral pyre for secrets that would never see daylight again. 6 months later, Buck stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching Elena tend the garden she'd planted in the spring thaw. The morning air still carried the sharp bite of altitude, but warmth was returning to the mountain as summer approached. The arms shipment had been intercepted just as it crossed the border, thanks to evidence Elena had salvaged from Cortez's burning office. Colonel Webb faced court-martial, Ramon Vasquez was in federal custody, and Cortez himself had fled to Mexico, leaving behind an empire that crumbled without his organizing presence. Marshal Thompson had proven himself worthy of Elena's trust, using her evidence to expose a conspiracy that reached deeper into military and government circles than anyone had suspected. The investigation was still ongoing, with new arrests happening monthly as prosecutors followed the money trails Elena's documents had revealed. Diego and the surviving members of his pursuit team had been captured 3 days after the warehouse fire, found wandering the mountains without supplies or clear direction. Without Cortez's organization to support them, they'd become just another group of bandits, easily rounded up by territorial authorities who finally understood what they were dealing with. The tomatoes are coming along nicely, Elena called out, brushing dirt from her hands as she approached the porch. Your mountain soil is richer than I expected. Mountain provides what you need, if you know how to work with it. Buck handed her a cup of coffee, noting how the morning light caught the gold in her dark hair. Same principle applies to most things worth having. Elena settled into the chair beside him, the same chair where he'd spent countless solitary mornings before she'd arrived in his life. Now the silence between them felt comfortable rather than empty, filled with shared understanding and unspoken promises. Any regrets? She asked, a question they'd discussed several times since deciding to build a life together on the mountain. About leaving civilization behind again? None whatsoever. Buck smiled, watching Bristle chase a chipmunk through the timber. The old dog had recovered his vitality since Elena's arrival, as if her presence had reminded him that life held pleasures beyond mere survival. What about you? Miss the excitement of city life? The excitement nearly got us killed. I prefer mountain excitement, weather, wildlife, wondering if the roof will hold through another winter. Elena reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. Besides, I've discovered I like waking up next to someone who thinks a dangerous day involves checking the trap lines. Buck laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as the months passed. Elena's presence had restored something he'd thought permanently lost when Sarah died. Not a replacement for what he'd had before, but something new and equally precious. Marshal Thompson's letter arrived yesterday, Elena said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. The final prosecutions are scheduled for next month. He wants us to testify in Denver. Long trip for an old mountain man. Worth it to see justice done properly. Elena studied his face carefully. Unless you're having second thoughts about leaving the mountain again. Buck considered the question seriously. Their previous journey to civilization had been necessary, but uncomfortable. Too many people, too much noise, too many reminders of why he'd chosen isolation originally. But testifying would complete what Elena had started when she first took those damning papers from Cortez's office. We'll go, he decided. Finish what we started, then come back where we belong. Elena smiled, the expression carrying relief and affection in equal measure. I was hoping you'd say that. Thompson also mentioned something about a reward from the federal government recognition for exposing the arms smuggling conspiracy. Money? Money, and something called a civilian commendation for service to national security. Elena's voice carried pride, mixed with amusement. Apparently, stopping a potential border war qualifies as noteworthy achievement. Buck shook his head, marveling at how life could change so completely in such a short time. A year ago, his greatest concern had been whether winter supplies would last until spring. Now he was being honored by the federal government for preventing international incidents. What would your father think? Buck asked, knowing Elena still struggled with memories of her military father. He'd be proud, I think, not just of stopping the conspiracy, but of finding someone worth fighting beside. Elena's voice softened with emotion. He always said the best soldiers weren't the ones who fought hardest, but the ones who knew what they were fighting for. Buck understood the compliment and the deeper meaning behind it. Elena had found her own war to fight, her own cause worth risking everything to defend. That she'd chosen to fight it beside him was a gift he'd never expected and didn't take lightly. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A rider was approaching on the main trail, moving at the steady pace of someone familiar with mountain travel. Buck recognized the horse before he could clearly see. The rider, Marshal Thompson himself, making the long journey up from Cedar Ridge. Expecting company? Elena asked, noting how Buck's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle. Not expecting, but not surprised either. Buck relaxed as he confirmed the rider's identity. Thompson mentioned he might visit before the trials begin. The marshal reached their cabin, looking trail-worn but determined. He was older than Buck had expected from their previous correspondence, a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and the careful bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous people. Mr. Rawlins, Miss Vasquez, Thompson said, dismounting and approaching their porch with obvious respect. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. Any friend of justice is welcome here, Elena replied, offering him coffee and a place to rest. Thompson accepted both gratefully, settling into their circle with the ease of a man comfortable in wilderness settings. I came to discuss the trials, but also to make you an offer. Buck and Elena exchanged glances, both curious about what kind of offer would bring a federal marshal up a mountain personally. The investigation into the arms smuggling conspiracy has revealed similar operations in other territories, Thompson explained. Networks of corrupt officials, military personnel selling weapons to hostile forces, criminal organizations with international connections. The federal government is establishing a special investigation unit to address these threats. Sounds like important work, Buck said carefully. It is, and it requires people with very specific skills, knowledge of frontier territories, ability to operate independently in hostile environments. experience with both military tactics and criminal investigation. Thompson met their eyes steadily. People like you. Elena felt her heart race with unexpected excitement. You're offering us jobs. I'm offering you the chance to serve your country in a way that uses everything you've learned. Thompson pulled out official-looking documents. Federal investigators reporting directly to Washington with authority to pursue arms smuggling operations wherever they lead. Buck studied the papers without touching them, understanding that this moment would determine the direction of their lives together. Return to comfortable isolation on the mountain, or accept responsibility for fighting similar battles across the frontier. We'd have to travel, Elena observed. Extensively. Montana Territory, Dakota, Colorado, Arizona, anywhere, illegal arms trafficking threatens national security. Thompson's voice carried conviction that this work mattered. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe, but it will make a difference. Buck looked at Elena, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her expression. They'd found peace on the mountain, but they'd also discovered they worked well together in dangerous situations. More importantly, they'd learned that some fights were worth having, some causes worth serving. When would we start? Elena asked. After the trials conclude. Call it a honeymoon assignment. Your first case would be investigating reports of weapons theft from Fort Collins. Thompson smiled at Elena's surprised expression. Yes, I noticed the way you two look at each other. Mountain Air must agree with both of you. Buck reached for Elena's hand, finding her fingers ready to intertwine with his. They'd begun this journey as strangers, thrown together by circumstance. They'd become partners in survival, then allies in justice, and finally something deeper, two people who'd found in each other the missing pieces of their own lives. We'll do it, Buck said, speaking for both of them with the certainty of a man who'd found his purpose again. Together. Elena squeezed his hand, her smile bright enough to warm the mountain morning. Sometimes the best adventures began not with plans or preparations, but with simple willingness to follow love wherever it might lead, even if it led right back into danger. Behind them, the mountain waited with its ancient patience, knowing that some people were meant to wander while others were meant to return, and that the wisest souls learned to embrace both destinies as different seasons of the same life.